So anyway, nice to meet you. Yeah, nice to meet you too. And I'll try to look you up Sunday and see if we can meet you on too. And the ladies on the corner, right? Okay. So Linda. Good evening. Sims, S-I-M-S. You, minivan. And I haven't met this young lady right here. Hi, I'm Jeff.
I'm Marlene.
Marlene, Jeff Jennings. And I'm going to take this opportunity too, Marlene, working at Steve Brunner.
Marlene
Williams, okay, Jeff Jennings. Marlene.
But we do have.
So Steve G. Come on, sit down. Yes. The class has changed since the last time I was here. I think I missed the time before. Well, 2 weeks ago we didn't meet because of the storms.
Good evening. Sunday morning. Sorry. Yeah. It is really windy. I mean, I see sometimes that we're all short and all that. It's just like,
We'll wait a little bit, let see if any more come.
It's for three.
Yeah, just for 3.
Your first point on the second page makes me feel better. Because we've been, when we do our daily reading, we listen to it.
Right.
So that makes me feel better.
Yes.
Because I thought, well, maybe I'm cheating a little.
No.
Especially when you're going through Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. I've tended to skip that, reading that.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the reinforced sections of what I must read. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Some of it I think I can go to heaven without some of that stuff.
Yellow outlines on the corner.
For those reading out and hearing it read through my phone really brings to life more than just droning on.
Good evening. We'll go ahead and start. We may have some others come and join us. For those who are listening in, we have succeeded in avoiding any ice and snow, and then have been able to be entertained by hail and tornadoes. So we're just kind of fitting in from there. We'll work some from the yellow outline, and then if you have the blue one, we're going to cross over and do some things there, in that we just handed that out at the end. And a part of that will be just for you to read on your own, but we'll still kind of work through that. The main thing I want us to start with is that, and I put this in bold, relationships define terminology. And the reason I wanted to start with this is that, and we've talked about several things on the top of the page, but when we describe the and I use the term petitions and requests in that petitions are going to be more formal and requests are going to be more personal. And we noticed, for example, well, let's look at that paragraph just above that. It says, a letter often functions in the same way that a person who is absent would function if they were present. In many letters, there's a section that was devoted to making the request of the reader, and the relationship between the two parties determines what type of petition is appropriate for the occasion. So we started with the first one, and we're just going to introduce it again and just do it very briefly. In that, routine, and there may be as many routine petitions as there are the other three, but routine petitions are used in business relationships, when you're writing to an unknown person to request something to be done from the government, an official or bureaucracy. And the word that just sticks with me is just nameless and faceless. If you're just writing to someone in the bureaucracy, especially in the Roman bureaucracy, and I urge you, I ask you, I plead you, relationship defines terminology, and that's when just the routine petition is appropriate. The second one, and we'll look at kind of 2 and 3 more tonight, and then Lord willing, we'll spend most of the time on the last one for the last night. But we use the term formal petition in that when there is a sense of distance and you're writing to the prefect, you're writing to someone who is in a higher position of authority. So if someone is a known position of authority, and if the two parties are in a state of conflict, and anytime you want to kind of express when you make the request, you acknowledge there's a sense of distance, there's a sense of difference. And as I said, I found 3 of these with a wife writing about transactions to be taking place during their divorce. So, dear honey, and how are you doing? And everything's fine is not appropriate. And so the formal petition, and I always kind of do this, when you know the person is in a higher position, not just nameless and faceless government bureaucracy, or if you have a sense of conflict and you want to express a sense of distance by how you make the request, then the formal petition is the appropriate one. Then we switch words to the word request, because we're going to move from kind of the more formal and the bureaucracy and states of conflict. And we use the term familiar requests. And if you'll notice this, family members, business partners, and when you see, and it's erotao is the word, but when you see this familiar request, then you virtually will know that there is already a relationship between the reader and the writer, because what did we say at the top? Relationships determine terminology. And anticipate, and we'll look at this, familiar requests are going to be in the book of Philippians and Thessalonians. So 2 of the churches that Paul is probably as close to as anyone else, then when it comes time to request something to be done, then he will use the familiar request. And it can be used by friends, family members, business partners, when you make a request between people who often share the same status and know each other face to face. So, Brad had to go to a meeting tonight, but I used he and I as an example. If we're business partners, and as we mentioned last week, we can both be illiterate, and because the scribes have these manuals and prescribed ways to do this, to ask your business partner and use a term that is nameless and faceless wouldn't be appropriate, because this is your business partner. And neither, and I always do this with the formal petition, neither would it be appropriate to then use number 2, the formal petition with your business partner, because you share a face-to-face relationship. So anytime you see this one, then you know that they're basically on the same level. There's a relationship that's there. And again, it wouldn't be appropriate to say nameless and faceless. Wouldn't be appropriate to do this. He's certainly not a high official. And so that relationship that those two people share then will determine the type of petition that's used. So you begin to see it's kind of like social fingerprints, that this far away, when you know how the petitions function and you identify the petition in a letter, that will automatically tell you the things that you can't see this far away, but the type of petition then will determine which is appropriate when you're writing that particular person. All right? Now, number 4, and I use the term personal request, and we'll spend the majority of our time next week, but this is Paul's signature term in ministry. And and we'll come back to this again. When we come to the example of Philemon, he says, I could order you what to do, but I prefer to, and your translations will say either appeal to you, beseech you, urge you. But of the 3 petitions, number 4 carries the most sense of urgency. Para, and if you all just write this out in English, put the word para, P-A-R-A, and then this isn't in the word, but put a dash, and then put the word K-A-L-E-W. Parakaleo. And para is to have someone alongside, and kaleo is to call out to someone. Let's go ahead and read the paragraph, and then I'll give you, and we touched on this, but like I said, we'll come back to it. A personal request shares the positive relationship of the familiar request, but it's more urgent or pressing. So we said last week, Brad and I are partners up and down the Nile. We're both illiterate, but we know what to do. We go to the scribe, and they were like under a tree at the corner. Everybody knew where the scribe was, kind of like everybody knows where the hairdresser is type thing. And you just basically defined the relationship and then dictated the letter to them. But the scribe would then want to know what is the relationship between the two people. And then when it came time to do the request, then the request also gives us the sense of the relationship between the two parties, but parakaleo is more urgent than number 3. So if our account is about to be overdrawn, and then I urge you to make a deposit into the account, would be, number 4 would be more urgent than number 3. Number 3 is kind of like when you get to it, everything's fine, don't worry about it. We have a positive relationship, there's nothing urgent. Parakaleo carries a greater sense of do this, a greater sense of urgency. And here's what's important. It will come right nearly up to command, but it won't cross the line. Let's finish the paragraph and then we'll explain this. And again, we'll come back to this next week. When something needs to be done quickly or something that's done because of its importance, the personal request notifies the reader of the seriousness of the writer. This request pulls one close. Para alongside, call someone alongside. It seeks to allow the reader to respond in harmony with their relationship. And Paul's going to mention this in 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 11. What I am when I'm present, I am in my letter. And there are a number of critics, and we'll touch on this before we finish. There are a number of critics about Paul, but let me just go ahead and do this. It's one of those few terms where the original word, we get close to it. The Corinthians let me say it this way, the more kind of sophisticated, educated, uppity Christians in Corinth, when they spoke of Paul, this is the word they use, and write this out in English: IDIOTES. IDIOTES. And idiotes is a bumbling amateur when you expect a professional. May I say karaoke? We have a dear friend, and his son he can talk. He's a very, very bright boy, but he can go all day and not use 10 words and just be totally happy. But you get him on a microphone, and you can hardly tell the difference between the guys on the radio and him. He can just nearly duplicate the sound. We go to the state fair every year, take all the kids individually. My wife never joins me in the karaoke tent. Oh, come on. No.
You say never?
Never.
Maybe once.
Well, she will walk by, but she won't go in. Walking by is close enough for her. But you know what I'm saying? Sometimes somebody gets up and you think, wow, they are really, really good. But that's not often the case. This hasn't been there for a while. When the stock car races were there, the guy that's in the water thing that you got to to hit the lever to dunk him, the dunk thing, we went by and again, I'm easily entertained, so we stopped for a little bit. And this guy he was a smart aleck. I mean, he ridiculed, he made fun, and you dumb okies, and on it went. And I'm guessing this kid was about 6'2", so start at the bottom, boots, fitted jeans, cowboy hat, and you can just imagine the guy on the other side. Yak. Sidearm. He dunked the guy 3 times in a row. If he wasn't a starting pitcher, he was a relief pitcher, and that thing wasn't very big, And got dumb okie and cowboy and all this other stuff, and he didn't say a word. And you know how the pitcher turned sideways when you got a runner on base, and he threw that thing sidearm and just dropped that guy in the water. And of course, he was as surprised as the rest of us. He hardly got on his perch and just got the next word out of his mouth, and then he dunked him again. He did it 3 times in a row, and the crowd just went absolutely, berserk. Well, idiotes is, and it's not a compliment, it's somebody who is not educated, somebody who is not well trained, someone who speaks maybe in the common vernacular. Can I use our term hillbilly? That's not a Greek term, but that type of thing. And so the Corinthians, there are some Corinthians who hope that there aren't any visitors when Paul comes to speak at church on Sunday. Apollos, whole different matter. He's eloquent. He's mighty in the scriptures. And when Apollos is there, everybody kind of goes, isn't that wonderful? And then when Paul's there, it's a whole different thing. And we'll talk about that later. But this request, parkaleo, is going to be the signature of Paul's ministry. I'm just going to do one, and like I said, of this, and we'll do some more next week. I want you to turn in the book of Philippians to chapter 4. And again, here's the church that, as far as we can tell, has supported him more than anyone else. They've been faithful, dependable. And Sheila and I were talking about this. The irony is that a man is involved in the Macedonian call, and he ends up going across and speaking to women at the riverside, place of prayer. We assume there probably wasn't the 10 Jewish men to have a synagogue. And then there is a slave girl that Paul cast a demon out of. And then there's the Philippian jailer, and those apparently are the charter members of the Philippian church. And this is probably one of the most positive letters in the New Testament. But I want you to come to chapter 4, verse 1. My brothers, and see again, relationship. My brothers, whom I love and I long for, my joy and my crown. This is how you should stand firm in the Lord, dear friends. And then here comes the petition. I plead with Euodia and Syntyche. Marlene, how would it be for you to be in church on Sunday and Paul's letter says, I plead with Kristen and Marlene to agree with each other in the Lord?
She is different.
Yeah. But the letters are written for the ear before they're written for the eye. This will be read aloud in services. Can you imagine how quiet things get when Paul, he doesn't just say, like in Corinthians, oh, I have heard there's some divisions among you. He points out 2 sisters and calls them by name. Now, remember we did the T-post and the line? Stop and think. Have this mind within you that was in Christ Jesus, that even though he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself and he took upon himself the form of a servant, and being found obedient as a servant, he gave himself up. All these wonderful things in Philippians 2, what are they there for? As material to help 2 sisters to become Christ-like and come to agree with each other in the Lord. When you find the petition, and we'll come back to this later, but remember in Corinthians, I urge you to be united. Everything else, like the clothesline, everything else in the book of Corinthians, you can hang on that. And the behavioral objective for this whole letter, well, let me say it this way. Girls, this is an Australian term. Do not get your knickers in a knot when I say this. But what happens in a small church if you have 2 women who are after each other and at odds with each other? Hannah, help us out.
Everybody picks a side.
Everybody what?
Everybody picks a side.
They're not going to be happy until, are you on the good side or are you with them? This is true of men, let's be fair. But since this is in the Bible, I'll tell you, if you get 2 sisters who are really at odds with each other, it impacts the whole church. Now, Sheila was elementary, special aid teacher, whatever. Excuse the idiom, but you'll know what I'm trying to say. She said 2 little boys can get in a fight and just kind of beat the snot out of each other. And then by the afternoon, they're walking down the hall with their arms around each other. She said when 2 little girls have a cat fight, they're not walking down the hall with their arms around each other later that afternoon. So remember, we use the term behavioral objective. And as we go through the next time, we'll give you the list in each one of these. And when you know this is what he is asking them to do, then do Grandma's clothesline, put up the behavioral objective, and you can put everything in the book will help to accomplish that particular part of that. But before we leave, notice verse 3, and this is the familiar request. And we'll write these down for you, but while we're here. So here comes the personal petition, and it's addressed for 2 sisters. And what does he tell them to do? Agree with each other in the Lord. Now, here's the irony. I assume these are real people. SYN is the word like syndicate, close to symphony, synthetic. SYN, like two criminals are crucified with him. SYN is the word for things that get together. So the first sister her name means get together, and she's at odds. And the second sister, EU, is the Greek word for good. Well done, good and faithful servant. Guess what good is? EU. So get together is at odds with sister good. We're not given any details. We're not told what's going on. But in this wonderful, wonderful church, the behavioral objective for the book of Philippians is to tell, I do things together to learn to get along with the good sister. Then the familiar request, and look back at number 3, the familiar request is one for family members, people that you have a close relationship. Then the next verse, he says, I ask you. What do you have in verse 3? Ask?
Yes, and I ask you.
Okay. He's also then going to use the familiar request. And fellow yoke fellow is the rest of you. Okay. If he was from the south, he'd say y'all. Okay. I ask y'all, loyal yoke fellow, help these two sisters work this out. So watch what happens then as you read and teach from a book when you know what the behavioral objective is as you start reading and going into the book. It just gives you a whole different paradigm. 1, for what to emphasize. 2, then you know from Paul's point of view, this is specifically what he's asking the people to do. Now, I want us to look, I'm still on the yellow page. We touched on this on the very first night, and this is a quick review. Here again is, and it's to me the clearest example. Paul has converted Onesimus, and remember, the word Onesimus means useful. So here's the pun. Useful has become useless and has ran away. So when you know that Onesimus means useful, and you read through Philemon, and there's a pun on his name, and so the servant, whose name means useful, has become useless and has ran away. And while Paul has been in contact with him, Paul has been a part of teaching the gospel. He's now a Christian, and now Paul is sending useful back. The legal law is the master could kill him on sight. And so this is going to be in conjunction with the letter to the Colossians. And so I'm confident that Paul wants Philemon to read the letter before he sets eyes on the runaway slave. And you read through this, there's all these appeals. I appeal to you. Talks about, I'm an old man, and don't take any fact that I'm in prison and I've got arthritis and I've been beat up, and I wouldn't want to bring this up, but you owe me your very soul. But don't let that influence what you're going to do. And I love Philemon because it is the quintessential finesse rather than bull in a china closet book in the whole Bible. But notice specifically the terms. I could order you what to do, and I underline this, I appeal to you on the basis of love. And see, look at what's happening. As the apostle, he's in a higher position. But he prefers not to do that, and so he comes down to the brother position. Everybody see what I'm trying to say? And rather than pulling rank and saying, as the apostle, he could just say, take him back. And probably Philemon would say, yeah, we're going to do that. But here's what's important. That expression, the righteous will live by faith, is such an important thing. And the appeal and the request allows the person to know this is exactly what Paul wants me to do, but he has left it up to me to actually do what he's asked me to do, rather than being the sergeant in charge of the platoon and saying, okay, guys, hit the road. We're going to run this morning. Now, we'll do this again next week, but just to me, it's still just so appropriate. One of our close friends and a deacon at Eastside was the defensive coordinator, Carl Albert. And in 20 years, I think they won 11 5A state championships. And the coaches were better teachers than they were coaches, which isn't often the case. So the honors chemistry teacher, the honors biology teacher, virtually all the coaches taught upper level math and science. And one of them was the drama teacher. But every year they worked and worked and worked. But here it happens. The teams other teams marching down the field and get on the 20 and they call timeout. And we've all seen coaches either hit somebody or grab somebody. These guys would call timeout and they'd get together. Here's the line, here's the linebackers, whatever. And typically, especially Mike, would put his arm around the two main guys and say, guys, we're going to need to draw the line right here. We need to do everything we can to stop them right here. And what did they do? They pulled them close, and these guys would run through a brick wall for their coaches. Well, because of previous relationship, then Paul is going to use parakaleo, that the letter is a necessity because physically he's not there, but this is what he would do if he was there. What I am in my letters, I will be when I'm there in person. And so this is his signature of how he does ministry. And he's going to call people, he's going to challenge people, he's going to say, this is what I want you to do, but it's not a command. So if you think, here's the command, and you go right close to it, and that's why the personal request is more intensive. The personal request, it has a greater sense of urgency. This is what I'm appealing and calling you to do. And next week, we'll go through and just look at the samples and look at more of those in detail. Yes, sir.
Since he doesn't give us any information of what they were at odds with in the Lord, said it should have been, or probably was, something in the congregation knew what the odds were.
Yes. And I'm not talking down to you when I say this. It's just an observation. I started my first job in 71. So I would just say in 50 years, my observation is 80 and sometimes 90% of our conflicts are more interpersonal than they are doctrinal. There will occasionally be the wolf in sheep's clothing. That happens. Whatever percent you want to refer to it, the largest percent of the problems that we have in the Lord's church start out as personal, and when he and I can't agree, at some point I'm going to make it doctrinal and bring the Bible in to get my way and to beat him over the head. But more of our conflict, more often, is interpersonal than it is doctrinal. And like I said, there's times where people come in and teach something that's totally wrong, but the vast majority of conflicts that we have in the church, something happened, and we're not told what it was, but at the same time, then you can see then the book of Philippians then becomes a handbook for how can we go about as yoke fellow to try to help these people to come to a sense of agreement and to find the Spirit of Christ rather than whatever the conflict is to be able to resolve that. Now, let's turn the page. We'll come back to this because we have some of our friends who are gone this week. We'll come back and touch on this. I'll do these fairly quickly, but these are 7 suggestions for just reading a letter. And like, for example, whether you're a student or a teacher and a class is coming up, the other thing I just encourage you to do if you have never done this, at some point, like I said, I did this with the book of Titus especially. We're 26 years old. We move halfway around the world. We're trying to fit into another culture, and the list goes on and on. And so for a year and a half, nearly every day, not every, but nearly every day, I read something from the book of Titus, not because I'm teaching on that on Sunday, but just to live within that and to have that as a part of kind of my spiritual diet while I'm trying to survive coping with moving half around the world. And like, for example, you could do a section from Romans, either Romans 8, Romans 12, Sermon on the Mount. But one of the really healthy spiritual things you can do is just to spend some time and absorb the passage. Can I use the term, if I use the term ruminate, when the mama cow has chewed a lot of grass, she sits down and here comes up, and she chews it up a little bit. You've got 4 stomachs going on, and she is ruminating. Sheep and cattle will both do that. And sorry, this is pretty sad. My dad and his younger brother, they came up to the state fair, and I don't know where they got them, but they ate too many green apples. And after the 3rd time that they had to stop, my granddad put the tailgate down on the Model T and said, "You will take care of your business off the back of the tailgate. We are not stopping again on the way home." My dad has never eaten a green apple since then. What's the difference in something that's seasoned and ripened and something that's green? Okay, again, gross but appropriate. If I only study to teach, I call that spiritual bulimia. It just comes in to come out. And so one of the most helpful things we can do spiritually is just to take a section of Scripture and just let it kind of walk with us, let us season it, let us think about it. So here are suggestions when you approach a letter in whatever the context is. And this was Charlie Powell's term. We should always be trying to understand the original intent before we start making applications today to a letter that's written 2,000 years ago. I'm going to say the same thing in a different way. The application of a letter should never say something to us that it would never have said to somebody in the 1st century. And to the degree that I can understand better the original intent, and with my understanding of that, then I'm in a better position to say, and this is what Paul is calling us to do and be today. So, suggestions for original intent. And this is harder. I'm the first to say this. Romans and 1 Corinthians, this is harder to do. But you look at Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, so many of the others. If at all possible, read the letter completely through in one setting. And one of our dear friends lived in Lawrence, Kansas. And I told Jeff, I said, "Jeff, are you just tempted to pull over to all those scenic parks between Oklahoma City and Lawrence, Kansas, and all those waterfalls and wooded area that you encounter as you're driving across northern Oklahoma and Kansas?" He got and of course this was a few years ago, but he got a CD set of the New Testament, and he listened to the New Testament a book at a time while he's on the road to go visit his folks. We were talking and he said, I have heard things that I don't think I would have seen with my eyes. And I got to do a class on history writing in the ancient world. And the biggest takeaway is that the New Testament was written for the ear before it was written for the eye. Remember, Paul says to Timothy, be involved in the public reading of Scripture. Turn real quick to Revelation chapter 1, and this will depend on our translations. Jeff, do you want to read 1 and 3? Revelation 1:3, verse 3.
Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy and heed the things which are written in it, for
Okay.
the time is near.
Okay. In other translations?
Read aloud.
That's what I say. When I read this, I add in parentheses, listen very carefully, blessed is he who reads. And see, this is written to the 7 churches of Asia. So guess what they're going to do on Sunday when the book of Revelation comes? This is going to be worship on Sunday. Blessed is he who reads. And see, you can think initially, oh, well, 2 eyes in a book. They don't have a book. How long is it going to take to copy the book of Revelation by hand? Yes, eventually there's going to be some copies, but initially, okay, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, blessed are those who read aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it. And once you understand this paradigm that our text is written for the ear before it's written for the eye, that's what I said. Sometimes if you can, just listen. I know I've told Kim this, and I wouldn't try to tell people who aren't members of the church, they would think I was a polygamist, but I am married to Mary from about 5 o'clock in the morning to about 10. And she listens to sections of the Old Testament. She does her quiet time. She has a devotional time. She's usually 5 lessons ahead for ladies' class. And the girl is just really, really focused on committing from 5. We don't have little kids. We're not doing breakfast for little ones. And so I'm married to Mary from about 5 till 10. And then from 10 till we go to bed, I'm married to Martha. And if you're on the list that you need food, then we're going to be taking food to you. You are not allowed to come to a church fellowship without bringing 3 homemade items in case somebody forgot to do something. And so I'm married to Mary from about 5 o'clock until 10 each morning. And then from 10 through the rest of the day, then I'm married to Martha for the rest of the day. But the girl listens to God's word, literally. And if you've never done that, I just encourage you to kind of look at that. And we have a lot of apps. I mean, the opportunities to do that today are just a world apart than they were even just a few years ago. So remember, read through an entire book if you can, or listen to an entire book. And what's helpful is that, and this is me, sometimes I get started and think, oh, here's something, and I get sidetracked, and then I don't come back and follow the flow completely through. One of our friends who was just ahead of us at OC is an Old Testament specialist. And Harold Shank was the president of Ohio Valley in West Virginia for 7 years. And during the 7 years, for mental sanity, he wrote 2 500-page commentaries on the book of Deuteronomy. which would put most of us in the loony bin. But his policy is, I read a book through 40 times before I read about anybody else. So he's done Deuteronomy, he's done Joshua, Judges and Ruth, and the last 3 years he's been doing 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Can you imagine reading through the first 9 chapters of genealogies in 1st Chronicles 40 times? And that's just his policy, is that if he's teaching it, he prefers to do it 25 or 30, and he just reads through the whole book. Well, you've got to have time set aside to do that. You've got to have something to, refreshment or something else. But think of the smaller books. If you've never done this, and again, Titus is 3 chapters. Philippians is 4 chapters. And if you've never done this, either with eyes or with ears, read through an entire book one time. So when we look at what the letter is about, we've used this term before. Oftentimes there is this disclosure formula. We did this from the first week. I want you to know, I do not want you to be ignorant, or as for you. And when you find the first disclosure formula, then that's going to mark off the opening of the letter. And the main point of the letter will be before that first I want you to know. And this oftentimes is the transition between the opening and the body. Number 3, identify any specific things that are said about God in the opening sections. Theos is the word for God. Logos, the word became flesh. So Charlie's term, theologian, are just statements about God. And in every letter, there are some very specific things said very, very early about the character and the nature of God, and these will serve as foundations through the book. Number 4, read carefully the opening and closing section several times. Look for common themes and common words. And look at then number 5. Listen to the prayer and thanksgiving sections, especially in the introduction. And Paul will often identify important concepts that will be developed later in the letter. So we're going to do a sample. Turn to Ephesians chapter 1. Two or three things are really helpful, and this is not something we would normally get out of our English translations, but just kind of make a note for yourself. Verses 3 through verses 14 in English is one sentence in Greek. Let me say the same thing again. In our text, from verse 3 down through 14, as Paul originally wrote it, is one sentence. And the letters are more like someone talking by dictation, which I think he did a lot, which we'll look at later. But that helps you to understand that. He starts with this: blessed be, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. He has blessed us in the heavenly places with every spiritual blessing in Christ. And then in verse 4, here is the theologian. Here's the key statement about God. The subject is He, which is going to be who? God. And what did God do? Pardon? No, I'm in verse 4. God chose, and what's the object? Us. So the subject of verses 3 through 14 is God chose us. And there will be all these qualifiers, discussions, and everything else. But when you then know that the first sentence is from verse 3 to 14. This is kind of his opening thought. Then he's going to move into what he normally does, and when he says, I thank God for, I pray about, or whatever, let's start reading again. And you want to pick up for us in verse 15. And when he says either I pray that, I'm thankful for, we're going to identify three things that he's going to be doing. And let's just read and I'll holler stop in a second.
Ephesians 1:15.
Yeah, 1:15.
Okay. For this reason I too, having heard of the faith in the Lord Jesus, which exists among you, and your love for all the saints, do not cease giving thanks for you while making mention of you in my prayers.
Okay, now watch. Oftentimes, Paul will give one of the main themes of the letter during the Thanksgiving and prayer section in the prologue. When he says, I pray that, I'm praying about, frequently, this is going to be the main part of the letter. And what I want us to notice, and we'll fish this out, he's going to mention three things, so let's keep reading.
That the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you a spirit of wisdom and of revelation in the knowledge of him. I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, so that you will know what is the hope of his calling. Okay, stop. I want you to know the hope of his calling. Next. What are the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints?
Number 2. Next.
And what is the surpassing greatness of his power toward us who believe?
So when you kind of read through this Thanksgiving, this prayer thing, when he comes to this important point, he's going to talk about hope. What's the second one?
Greatness. Surpassing greatness.
Yes.
Power.
Power is going to be number 3.
Riches.
Riches.
What version are you reading from? New American.
So if you look in verse 18, I pray that the eyes of your heart will be enlightened so that you will know the hope to which he's called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints, and his incomparably great power for those of us who believe. Now, prologue, beginning. Turn over to chapter 6. And when he says finally, notice, how does he conclude the book of Ephesians? Everyone find finally?
Be strong.
Verse 10. So finally is the clue. We're going to land this. We're going to come to the end. And what does he begin the conclusion of the letter with? Be strong. Remember I said oftentimes there's T-post at the beginning and at the end? What were the three things that he prayed for at the beginning? Hope, riches, power, strength. And then he'll say, finally, be strong in the Lord. There is a thread that runs all the way through Ephesians, and the most significant theme that's developed all the way through the book is the power and the strength and the might that God wants to give to his people. Go back to chapter 1. Nearly every word for strong and powerful and mighty is going to be used after he has said those three things: riches and hope and power. And then notice, I'm in the middle of 19, that power is like the working of his mighty strength, exerted when he raised Jesus from the dead, above all rule, authority, power, and dominion. And there's a cluster. It will be introduced here, and then all the way through the book, Paul's going to keep emphasizing the significance and the importance of that. Sample again. Look in chapter 3. Verse 16. He may strengthen you with power through his Spirit. Verse 18, you may have the power with all the saints. Verse 20, to him who's able to do immeasurably more than we ask or think, according to the power that is at work within us. So you see what I'm saying? Once you know how the opening functions, and oftentimes if he does the Thanksgiving, the prayer, whatever, he will give you hints and clues. If he comes to the end of the letter and brings one of those things back up, then you start reading through the letter, and it's amazing how that thread will run through the book that will be in the opening prologue, and then we'll come up again in the conclusion. So, when I teach from the book of Ephesians, and one of my farming friends, he said, just show me the flower and don't tell me about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. I just want to know what the flower looks like. So I just give the conclusion. Here's something very significant in Paul. It's confusing in adult class. You don't have time to kind of back up and do this. But I'm very confident when I talk about the power that is in the book of Ephesians. And when you get a concordance out, somewhere in Ephesians, he'll use nearly every word for power, strength, and might that's in the Greek vocabulary. So when you find it in the opening, and then you find it in the closing, then you can confidently stress that because, can I go back to original intent? I can determine the original intent because just like, and the first guy I worked with, he said, son, here's how you do a sermon. You tell them what you're going to say. You tell them, and then you tell them what you told them, and then shut up and sit down. And you think how often a lesson like that helps us to see, okay, this is the main point that he was trying to deal with today. And Paul would have done this in person, but since he's not there, then he uses the devices of the literary things to do the same thing in a letter that he would do if he was there in person. Yes?
Hey, Dale, to your point, I just thought this was kind of interesting. I don't remember who shared this, where I heard this from, but someone a long time ago told me that Ephesians is like God's power and light company.
Good.
And there's also a strong theme talking about glory throughout the book of Ephesians, so I think that's where you got the light part of that. But it is the main point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And you stop and think, I think it's a circular letter. When he says, I've heard about your faith. He was in Ephesus for 3 years. You typically, if you write into one church, you wouldn't say, I've been with you for 3 years and I heard about your faith. So it probably was a circular letter. But all of the people are within the shadow of one of the 7 wonders of the world. You can fit 3 of the Acropolises in Athens inside the Temple of Diana in Ephesus. So if you're meeting in someone's front living room or in some small hall or something, it would be easy to feel like you're just this little midget here within this splendor of one of the 7 wonders of the world. And all these people are involved in the images and the worship and the festivals and on and on. And so for the people who are living within the shadow of one of the 7 wonders of the world, he wants them to know God's power and God's strength is with you. And in that opening sentence, what was the subject? God chose you. And so once you know the theologian, it's God chose you, that becomes your foundation. And then your introduction and your conclusion then help you to see, oh, here were the functional things that he asked them to do. While we're here, go ahead and turn to chapter 4 and verse 1. we'll touch on this next week. There's one petition right in the middle of the book, and sometimes the petition is the transition from one section to the other. Let's read chapter 4 and verse 1, and you're going to hear, I urge, I beg, I plead. How does your translation read? Go ahead and read for you in the
You
middle.
want me to go ahead and
Yeah.
read? Therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called.
Okay? Other than implore, what do you have in your translations? Urge. And guess what this one is? Parkleo. I urge you to walk worthy of the calling you, and what's the calling you've received? He chose you. And once you see the foundation of what God has done underneath the letter, and then you see what happens in the beginning and the end, then here comes this petition. I urge you, I beg you, I beseech you, live up to what God has called you to do and to be. Now, whether it's true or not, I don't know, other than it is in ancient history writings. A young man was brought before Alexander the Great who had been caught stealing. And so imagine, here you're a little boy named Alexander, and then you're brought before the Alexander. And Alexander's comment was, either change your life or change your name. If you're going to carry my name, let's don't have you going around as a petty thief. If you're going to be Alexander, you either change your life or you change your name. And so for these people living within the shadow of one of the 7 wonders of the world, God chose you. I want you to know the hope of your calling, the riches that are involved, the immeasurably great power that we have within us who believe. And you read all the way through Ephesians, and that power is talking about on and on. And then you come to the end, and finally, I urge you to be strong in the Lord. And you see how it connects together? And so I don't get to go through, this is where I got this is how it came together. But when you understand how a letter functions, you can give the flour rather than the nitrogen and the potassium and the phosphorus without saying all these other things. And this is what I find really helpful. If I'm making the same emphasis and the same point that the writer made in the first century, then hopefully I can make good application to us 2,000 years later, because I have a better understanding of the original intent of what the letter said and meant to the people who read it first. 2 things, let's take a stretch break, okay? Why and how? Identify special requests or petitions that are used, and this will identify the relationship. It will reveal the intent in writing, and a request form may open a new part of the letter and serve as the behavioral objective. And like I said, I urge you to walk worthy of your calling is a major transition between chapter 3, kind of the doctrinal side, and then here comes the practical side. And we'll see some more of those when we come back. Have some items for kind of a break. Get up, stretch a little bit, get some. Come back and finish eating your seats, and we'll finish some more things up before we're done. That's good. Easier than passing around.
Just Rice Krispies.
It's harder to get up.
Yeah, I mean, it's rice, well, and the chocolate and butterscotch. Chips, yeah. The chips, mine, but the peanut butter's what I was worried about.
So that part that we're reading on where it talks about reading aloud and the reason for it. So that proved to be a not very good thing historically for Christians. even though that they needed that, because the church, the Roman Catholic Church, many people from, I mean, they were still unable to read. They had the scripture in Latin, and they didn't let people read it. So it seems like that even though we understand that once you, maybe some of the early people understood that this might be perverted, and they tried to get people to actually be educated. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know whether that's true or not, but I know that was a problem in Christian history as a whole. Said it was kind of a, easily perverted, because if you can't read it,
That's right. Well, and Greek is going to be the primary focus even of Rome until the 400s.
Okay.
And so initially, then it would have been obviously written, translated, copied in Greek. And then as the Roman Latin church begins to take control, then a part of the reason they wanted scriptures.
So that's how that happened.
Then they wanted it in Latin because the common person couldn't read it, and in a lot of communities, the only Bible was literally chained to the pulpit in the church building. And so if you could read Latin, that was the only opportunity you had. And then see, a big part of those early translators, while they were burned at the stake and stuff, was that they dared to translate the Bible out of Latin into the common vernacular.
Yeah, right. So that was real evidence of the guy that runs Hobby Lobby. What's his name? I can't think. He had a museum thing, a traveler that came here. It was pretty evident the stuff that was in the like how that happened.
Yeah.
I mean, how they persecuted people that tried to translate.
Wycliffe and Tyndale, and I think Wycliffe died a natural death, but at some point they dug his bones up and burned them. And then I think they killed Tyndale. And his high crime was he was translating the Latin scriptures into English. So that's why he needed to die.
Well, I mean, but that, I mean, historically for us, that turned out to be a bad thing. We have, even with being able to read and understand English, so the things can be, was the bad thing. I just thought that was, from our point of view, that it's understandable why he was telling that. Because this is the message. But it turns out that it was also used badly.
Well, and early church historians have said we can virtually reproduce the New Testament. And again, these are the first 3 to 4 centuries from the writings of what are called the early church fathers, because, again, even in writing to other people, they're going to have written quotations to make the point, because not everyone, one, is going to be able to have a copy in front of them, and then 2, their interpretation of this passage is the strength for why they're asking to do that. But they said where the New Testament had been destroyed, you could virtually reproduce it because they referred to it and quoted it so much, because that wasn't just a common everyday thing for people to be able to read it, to know it.
Well, it's kind of interesting because some commentators or some people talk about the letters, especially when sent to a congregation and they copied it and sent it on traveling letters. About that, how that happened, that there were possibly other letters to other congregations, but the fact that they would have contained the same, I mean, they would have contained maybe the same things that the other letters that were lost or it's just, I never had even thought about the possibility of that. Or if we found one today,
She said
that was
okay, right?
it should match up with.
They were saying
Paul mentioned, be sure you read the letter to the Laodiceans. And we don't have it. And I'm just convinced God and the Spirit are involved with the things He wanted us to have.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I did too, but I just, unless somebody tells you about stuff like that,
Yeah.
so you don't.
Yeah.
Were you
did.
in Oklahoma
Yeah.
in 1999? Remember the big tornado that went through? I was in that. I was a school teacher
Well, you can't miss the other guy.
at Western.
I'm just kidding.
I know it, I know it. I'm taking a lot of credit.
Program.
Taking a lot of what?
We never had.
Yeah.
And every car in the parking lot was
Yeah.
destroyed. And so it was, nobody was trained, which spoke well of people. But it's all, we were in the auditorium. It was supposed to be in Rochester. And they put us in the wings of it. So they always say, it sounds like a freight train. Just like a freight train. And ceiling tiles, the acoustic fell on top of us, but the problem there, but the place, the roof was peeled off. Beautiful thing, we're sitting in water and all that, so it was something. I've often thought, I wish I would have lived and watched and see how long it took. It wasn't more than a minute, 90 seconds. And then it was beautiful that night. They herded us all out, and we walked up to the next corner, and it took me forever to get home. Yeah. Well, no, I didn't. One of my fellow teachers said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I don't know." She said, "Well, come with me. My father-in-law can take you home." So I lived in Norman, and I couldn't go down Western because the debris and all the electrical lines were across Western. Couldn't go down. He took me over to 35. Couldn't do that. Same way there. He took me down 44 through Newcastle and south of the river and then back up. It took about 2 hours. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Workout places.
And they had told us all that.
Who's that? I got that. I got it at the top on water.
I shouldn't have gone.
Some of this, I think we'll get better.
Good. We're done.
That was a good part. It was an old station wagon. And I had told my daughter, who was, she was 11. I teased her, I said, "This is going to be a car when you're 16. It's a station wagon." So the worst thing she said when we got home was, "Daddy, I still have to drive that car." Not, "Daddy, are you okay?" But I don't have to drive the car now.
Well, there you were.
Yeah.
You just moved on.
Yeah. I took tornadoes seriously before that, but after that, I worked and the house that we just went to does not have storm shelter. And I had put two storm shelters in two houses.
I did too.
But
Yeah, Stuart had stuff going on.
Well, you're missing all, you're missing them.
Brad,
People right there.
Brad helps with county fairs. We've had a fair report.
yes, and I have Luke
Yeah, there's four right there. Olivia.
I don't know, we might still do it. We're scared to do it this year.
It's actually pretty good.
But maybe later.
Yeah.
It's
Thank you, thank you.
well, the first year, we were in our last house 10 years. And the second, let's see, we moved there in 14, so 15, just 1 year later, and already put a storm cellar in. It was bad. Really bad. He said, tornadoes come directly to North
Even in the morning, it was really big.
And so we got in the storm cellar. We had 2 dogs and a cat. We closed that lid because we were in the garage.
Oh, good.
Garage.
That's a great idea, thank you.
You could hear it over and over. This is 1999 all over again. And so, oh, it was terrible. And so, it was over. You could hear it over. And I looked at my wife and I said, "Are you ready for this?" She said, and I opened the lid. The garage door was still there.
Early on that paper you look at
Was.
you indicated that one of your instructors requested the way I interpreted that, had said that
It was just blowing.
the motion person
All new windows.
the request was never worked.
They did back out. But
So if it's personal,
that was made for.
some of the early things that I read called all of them petitions. Familiar petition, personal petition, and he said, I think the request is more consistent with the relationship.
Yeah.
So.
And that's going to become Paul's signature of how he's going to get things done.
While we lived in that house for 10 years.
Thank you.
So we're hoping that this area I know. My son-in-law said, well, you ought to be okay because you're out of that Norman Moore. Seriously. Because, all those ways, they go pretty much the same. People forget.
Coffee's pretty good. Great. Coffee's good.
I don't know if we think but our inspector said,
Ready?
Move on.
Fabulous. Thank you, guys.
this is my second or third move.
Like I said, go ahead and keep enjoying your snacks, and we're so delighted to have our little people with us. It's such a privilege to have them with us, so we're delighted that they're here. I want to do two things on 3 and 4, and we'll do these very quickly. The whole process and what we're doing tonight, two things happened. One, Charlie Powell, dear friend who's on staff and elder at Britton Road. For many years, Charlie has read through his Greek New Testament each year. That's no small feat. And I think he's taught maybe 30 neighborhood Bible classes. They'll put up the sign on Britton Road and have people come. And so he just has a hands-on ability with the text that I can work with it and I can translate it. I would be in a mental institution if I tried to read through the Greek New Testament every year. It's just something to be a real struggle to do. But there was a process of how do we describe this, how do we put it together, and the different things will help different people. And when you look at the circle, and while I'm thinking about it, if you remember, next week bring the one that has the different things because we'll come back and talk more about it. But this is the transition to how we got to the one with the colors, and I'll show you this on the next page. But if you look at a clock, okay, so like from 1 to 4, everybody see what I'm trying to say on the circle? Then that's like the opening, and we did initial descriptions. This is what takes place. Observation, here's the types of things that are there. And then the transition, like about 4 or 5 o'clock over to 7 to 8, is the middle. And again, that literary transition between I want you to know, I don't want you to be unaware, or just as for you, you translate into the middle. And then here comes the closing. And you will find a combination of things in the opening and the end, and in the petition that will give you a better understanding of what the original intent was when the letter was written. So if you look on page 4, this is one of the early ones, and we just would talk about this, and Charlie would make lists. And when you look at the colored one, you can see over time, kept reading, kept looking, kept observing, looking at different things. And so that page 4 is the transition to the fuller one, and you can kind of look at that and kind of see, okay, here's the transition and here's how things happened. And you'll see this was done back in 95 and then updated, and we still kind of look and talk about this. Where I want us to go to, though, is page 5. And for those who are listening in, I'm going to read these off, and you can do one of two things: either circle or do. I'm just going to identify the formal petitions. See them on the right-hand side. So Galatians 4 and 12 is a formal petition. Okay. Then when you go down to 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 20. That's a formal petition. And then the third one is going to be in 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 2. Okay. Now, some other identification, either want to do a star or a X or something. Let's go ahead and just list the familiar ones. And remember, the familiar request is where there's association, there's family and things. And I've already given you a hint. They're going to be in Thessalonians and in Philippians. So if you notice, I didn't put the list there, but in 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 1, the first one is a familiar request. The second one's going to be a personal request. That's 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1. There's a compound, but the first one's the familiar one. Then in chapter 5 and verse 12 is the next familiar request. And then 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 1 then is also a familiar request. Everybody okay? Did it confuse anybody? Now, what I want us to do is to then just kind of stop, and some of this we've kind of covered, others of it we'll leave you to read some details. We're going to just look initially at, and there are not very many, but look at the formal petitions. So I'd like you to turn to the book of Galatians, chapter 1. And if you have read Paul's letters through the years, you're going to anticipate, I thank God for, I pray that. This is just in virtually every letter. And next week when we look at this list again, this Thanksgiving prayer, I'm grateful for, how are you doing, on and on, is very, very typical. But what I want you to notice is that when you come to verse 6, Jeff, let's go ahead and read. And here's where our normal thanksgiving and prayer is. And notice what's in Galatians.
How far?
I'll holler stop.
I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another. Only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we, or an angel from heaven, should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed.
Okay, stop just a second. How different is that? Is I thank God for you. I remember you in my prayers. You see, and again, here's your structure of your letter. Normally where we have this, and then see like in Ephesians, I pray that, and then here comes the theme of the letter. My dad would say, you guys take the cake. I am amazed, it's thaumazo, I'm just stunned that you are so quickly removed from the gospel to another gospel, which is not a gospel. And guys, if an angel from heaven comes down, he and the messenger, let them be accursed. Let's keep reading.
10, is that right?
Yep.
For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ.
Okay. Remember we said that there's a literary device that goes from the opening to the body. And what is that? I want you to know, I do not want you to be ignorant. And guess what you find in verse 11? Yeah.
For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ.
Okay. Now, in the Bibles that I carry, I do a little line here and over, or at least draw a line, and I always have a line between verse 10 and verse 11. Because the disclosure formula, I want you to know, I do not want you to be ignorant, is the transition from blue to pink. So when you come to verse 13, let me recount. When you come to verse 11, then Paul has given his opening, his prologue statements in those first 10 verses, and then he has moved to the body of the letter when he says, I want you to know. Sometimes I do not want you to be ignorant. I do not want you to be uninformed. And so, and again, anticipate this, we'll go through it again in a little more detail next week. You have moved from the opening, and on this chart here, the blue, and then when you come to verse 11, you moved into the pink. See how that works? Now, on our yellow sheet, our and it's a formal petition. Well, let me just stop for a second. How different is "I am amazed at you guys" from "I thank God for you all"? Can I do this? And this is the only letter where the only petition in the letter is a formal request. Now let me go back. If a husband and wife are having a domestic, is this wonderful Australian term, and they're trying to sort things out, sometimes through the years we've sat down and I've said, okay guys, we need to learn to listen a little better, but we're not going to do everything at once. I want us to turn to 1 Corinthians 13, and when we start reading, love is, and what's the very first thing? Love is patient, and love is kind. We're just going to do two things this week. If we don't do patient and kind, we don't have to worry about the rest of them. And so rather than saying, here's this list that goes on, and love is this and this and this and this, we're struggling. That's why we're talking. And so for us to kind of start working and getting things back together, I want both of you this week to focus on two things. Love is patient and love is kind. But no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about love is patient, love is kind. Well, if Paul starts with, I'm amazed and you guys take the cake, and then he uses the normal warm parakaleo, the petition contradicts the entire tone of the letter. Everybody follow what we're doing now? So we're going to read, and Jeff read in chapter 4 and verse 12. So that's why I've given you the list. And as we finish the class, you can go back, and every time, and there's not one in Colossians, but there is in the others. And so before I work through a letter or teach through it, I want to know, and there's sometimes more than one. We'll look at those next week. What is the behavioral objective for the book of Galatians? And what is in 4 and verse 12?
I beg of you, brethren, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You have done me no wrong.
Okay. Tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day, Hebrew of Hebrews, Pharisee of Pharisees. And here people are coming in and trying to take the gospel and Judaism, the gospel and circumcision, the gospel and these things from the Old Testament. And here he is as the Hebrew of Hebrews and saying, instead of what's going on, become like I am a Jew, trained the feet of Gamaliel, but now I'm a servant of Christ. But the petition, well, check our translations. What do you have in verse 12? What was yours again? Okay, beg. What other words do you have?
Treat.
Beg, entreat. Pardon? Plead. And see, this is where, as long as you know where the words came from, our English translations will say different things. But this, again, is the word that the three wives used while they're dealing with the divorce with their husband. That's the one that always sticks in my mind, because I'm thinking there's no sweetheart and honey going on while we're fighting over who's going to belong and who's going to have. If we're writing to the governor, to the prefect, and we want to show respect and distance, we don't use warm and close and cuddly. We do this. And so the one book where Paul, the petition, when he finally urges and beseeches the behavioral objective, then he uses the formal petition, which then the petition indicates the tone of the letter, and the tone and the relationship of the reader and the writer will be revealed by the petition that they use. Everybody okay? Let me just mention one other thing, and we'll look at the ones in 2 Corinthians before we do. let me do the first part verbally, and I'll use my hands, but then some of you have been in class and I've done this, but you can just make a short note if we haven't. I'm going to start on this side. The word disciple is used 262 times in the New Testament. Gospels over and over and over and over and over, disciple, disciple. And then as you come into the book of Acts, you start a decline. And I want to say maybe by Acts 20, the word disciple is not used in the last part of Acts. It's not used in any of the letters, and it's not used in Revelation. So the most frequent word for the followers of Jesus is a disciple. Guess what word takes over from the middle part of Acts all the way through Revelation instead of disciple? Saint. So when you get your concordance, watch, here comes disciple, disciple, disciple. You'll start a decline, and I'm doing this rusty memory, but I think roughly by Acts 20, but you can tell it stops, and then you get to looking, and it's not used in any of the letters. It's not used all the way through the book of Revelation. Back in chapter 9, other than there were saints who were raised when the Lord was raised in Matthew, it's not used at all in the Gospels except at one time. It's not used in the first part of Acts, and then it starts being used. And from about a third of the way through Acts, all the way through Revelation, 13 times the inhabitants of heaven are called servants and saints. Now, I believe disciples are saints, and I believe saints are disciples. But they're not the same. And I'll just leave you to kind of work with that one and think, why is it that as we start writing to churches and as the church grows and develops, we're not called disciples? And I don't have any problem with us being called disciples. If any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross. That's a part of it. But it's just very interesting that once you kind of do that transition to the middle part of Acts, all the rest of the way through to the end, then the word saint becomes the predominant term that's used to describe the followers of Jesus.
I think that's because the disciples were ones that were close enough to the time of Christ and people associated with him. And the ones that are called saints are like us. We believe because of what they told us.
Yes, and there would be some difference between the eyewitnesses and the others, but I still do lessons on we are to be disciples. That's still, I think that's still a part of who we are, especially in following Jesus. So I don't have a conflict. I don't do either or. I do both and. But I just urge you, you just get a concordance out and you look, and it does this, and then here comes saint, and it goes here. And here's the reason why I brought this up. Paul uses the word saint in every church that he writes to except Galatians.
I have a question before you get into that. It seems that it would be appropriate to really never hear the word saints until the folks who are now then Christians in Acts.
Yeah. The sanctified ones, the coming of the Holy Spirit, there's a whole group of things that are there. The same way, and I did this on Sunday, I was at a men's retreat at Quartz Mountain years ago, had a break, walked over down to the dam and on, and I'm just thinking, where's the word grace in the Gospels? Law came through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus. From the fullness of his grace, I got to looking, didn't have a concordance, didn't have anything online. As soon as I got back to Midwest City, just sat myself down, went got a concordance. Depending on your translation, 3 or 4 times, the word saint is used in the Gospels. The acronym that I remember is that, saint is a cross word. Grace is a cross word. And it's only after the blood and the events of the cross then that the fullness of God giving us what we do not deserve takes place. And grace is virtually not used in the Gospels because the death and the resurrection and all those things haven't taken place. And see, it's significant where the Holy Spirit introduces us to terms and words. But let's go back to the Galatians, because I am amazed that you are so soon removed from the gospel. These people are on their way out. At least the Corinthians are fighting and trying to hang on. And so for the church, the only church, and you think, such were some of you? Going to church in Corinth is exciting.
So this really isn't a translation issue because there were distinct words for disciple and distinct words for saints.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really a translation issue.
No. I think it also indicates the distance that he is acknowledging, and there's just these deep, deep feelings that are there. He's doing everything he can. This is like someone who's fallen off the cliff, and you just barely have a hold of them by the hand, and you're trying to keep them from being lost. And yet, you guys are just nearly gone. And so, you see what I'm saying then? That's why to do this in the petition, to do the familiar petition, is not appropriate, because since the relationship is like this and he is so frustrated and disgusted with them, then when it comes time to say, I want you to do this, then here comes the formal petition. Everybody okay? And you see how the nature of the petition then defines the tone of then all of the other details that are in the letter. 2 Corinthians. And what we're going to find is that there is at least a blend. There's a petition besides just the formal one. We're not going to read the 1 and 2 verse 8. We'll do that next week. But when you come to chapter 5 and verse 20, okay, so here again is the same type of request that is in Galatians. Mind reading for us since you're right in the middle?
20? Just 20?
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were making an appeal through us. We beg you, on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God.
Beg you, help me, other translations. Implore, entreat, plead. You see how the word functions? Let's go ahead and go to chapter 10. And the fact that he's going to, well, let me take a half step back. The heading, just in my translation, this was done by man, Paul's defense of his ministry. 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 is as intense in Paul defending himself as the book of Galatians is with the frustration about they're so soon removed from the gospel. So, by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, and if you notice, I'm on the yellow sheet, the parkaleo is the personal request. So this is the one in verse 1. What do you have? I appeal to you. What do you have besides appeal? Beg, urge, entreat. And see, this is the very warm, close one. Paul, who is timid when face to face, but bold when away. And then here comes the formal one in verse 2. Mine says, I beg you. What do you have in verse 2? Ask. And so we've gone from this to this. Now, I want you to look. I'm going to read, first of all, I'm in chapter 10, 2 Corinthians, verse 8. See, and here's the word, the authority the Lord gave me to build you up rather than pulling you down. I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you with my letters. For some say, and here are his critics, his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive, and his speaking amounts to nothing. Carrie Heap Big Stick went out of town, weakling when face to face. What we are in our letters, we will be when we are there in person. Look in chapter 11, verse 5. Do not think I am the least inferior, and there's a big note of sarcasm here, those super apostles. I may not be a trained speaker, but I do have knowledge, and we have made this perfectly clear to you in every way. This is the section where Paul's critics call him idiotes. Can I use our term and say the karaoke man? See what just happened? So you read chapter 10 through 13, and you're going to find this, because he is defending himself against his critics, and because they are referring to him, oh, he's a wimp spiritually, he's a weakling. This is not a downer on Native Americans, okay? Don't go there. But my brother ran the 2 mile. One of his close friends was named Roy Bison. And Roy's family had a contract in the summer to go to where Bonanza and other Western things were being filmed, and were the Native Americans around teepees and stuff. They would get ready to run the race, and I can't remember if it's 9 or 10 minutes. I mean, 2 miles is 2 miles. And they get up to starting line, and Roy would just make some outlandish, I think I'll run such and such today. And my brother couldn't even, because it wasn't going to happen. Roy would run to the end, and then he would either trot or walk the back part, and then he would race in front of the stands, and then at least half of the lap he would walk or trot. He was going to be the last one by 4 or 5 minutes. He would not run the whole race. And so they're on this, Kent knows this. He's ran with him for 4 years. They're at the start line. He says some big whopper about, I think I'll run, 10 minutes or something today. And Kent, so we just over here going, oh dear. And all these other people are thinking, okay, Native American, he probably runs like the wind and all this other stuff. And when he was in front of the stands, he ran and his braids just flew out and everything. And then he got to the end and he would walk. He would do this for 8 laps. Carry heap big stick before a race starts. He didn't like to run. He just did that. And this is what's going on. The people are laughing at Paul. Oh, karaoke man. Carry big stick went away. Big, powerful letters. But he spiritually is a weakling. He is unimpressive. And he is idiotes. I'm not a trained speaker. And what they're saying is, Paul is a rank amateur, when if the gospel's important, we love to have someone like Apollos. And what does Luke tell us about Apollos? Apollos was eloquent and mighty in the scriptures. So when Apollos is in town, they all invite all their friends to come to church, because you're going to hear the gospel pronounced And Paul never puts Apollos down, but the Corinthians do. Remember, I am of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Christ. So here's these divisions. It continues on. And when he gets to the point of defending himself, then guess what is appropriate? Formal petition. Okay? I'm trying not to be too repetitive, but I want you to really see this. Once you understand how the petition functions, that will define the tone of the relationship and the tone of the letter. Everybody okay? So when we do the formal ones, Galatians only has one. No thanksgiving. No, I'm grateful for. No, I pray that. No, you guys are doing wonderful. I'm amazed. And we don't call them saints. So this is appropriate. When we come to the point of defending ourselves against being the karaoke man, and we want them to do something, then it's appropriate to use the formal petition. Everybody okay? We'll do the other ones quickly tonight. We'll touch on them. Go back. We're in 1 Thessalonians, because these will only be in Thessalonians and one in Philippians. These are the familiar ones. And remember, I told Brad, we're business partners. I need you to do something. It's not urgent. You don't have to do it quickly. So look in 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 1. I'll read from this just to save time. And look at how different this is. Finally, brothers. You already see the warmth that's there. We instructed you how to live in order to please God, and in fact, you're doing. And then here come two petitions. The first one is the familiar request, and the second one is going to be the personal one, which is more intense. So mine says, we ask you and urge you. Close in your translations? Help me? Okay. And see, ask is the familiar one. And that's something you use between friends. There's no quick urgency. Parakaleo is going to be the coach putting his arm around the guy, so he's going to do both of these together. I ask you and I urge you, and what is it? To live in order to please God. I want you to do this more and more. So the familiar petition is, we ask you in the Lord to live in order to please God. Then if you'll notice down in chapter 5 and verse 12, which then is going to be toward the end of the letter. So here's going to be in this book the transition to the closing. So when we come to 5:12, if I'm doing my sheet, we're going to move from pink to green. Everybody follow what I'm trying to say? In the same way that he'll say finally, which is appropriate, here's going to be a petition which brings us to the end of the letter. But we ask you, brothers, to respect those who work hard among you, who are over you in the Lord. So familiar is, here we are, the term brothers, the term saints. Everybody's on the same page. And look at me real quick. We don't have this going on. When we don't have this going on and things are normally and good, then we can use these terms of closeness and endearment. All right? Then look in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 1. Concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, are being gathered together. Again, we ask you, brothers. Everybody have ask? Request. And see, again, this is not the urgent one, but the familiar petition is on the basis of a positive relationship. And so, yes, he's given teaching about the second coming. There's been some misunderstandings, but we don't have people who've left the gospel. We don't have people who charge him with being the karaoke man. We're not defending ourselves. And so when we're still writing to brothers, but we want you to do this, then we can use the word ask. And then we've done the other one. This will take us 2 seconds. Back to Philippians. Seriously, Marlene, can you imagine how you and Kristen would feel if you're in church on Sunday and we have a letter from Paul and we get to this point, and the first one is the parkleo, it's more urgent, but just imagine the guy reading the letter says, and Paul says, I plead with Kristen and I plead with Marlene to agree with each other in the Lord. Everybody is awake by now. But here's this letter. This is one of the most positive, upfront, friendly letters. And then when you come to the behavioral objective, then all the things that are in the letter are to be used to try to call those two women to agree in the Lord. Then here is our familiar request. Yes, in verse 3, I ask you, and see, mine says loyal yokefellow. You have something close to that in your translation?
True companion.
True companion. Do you see what I'm saying? Even though we're making a request, we're still brothers. We're still wanting these two sisters to agree in the Lord. And when the relationship is like this, then to use this, or the nameless and faceless, the first one, those petitions aren't appropriate because this is a close and a warm relationship. And I would just say it this way. There are some things in the church that if we ignore are only going to get worse. And if we have two sisters who are just having trouble getting along, let's talk about it. Let's get it on. Let's get something done about this. Let's work this out rather than saying, well, maybe they'll sort that out later. And so the behavioral objectives are for two women to agree in the Lord, and all the rest of you, loyal companions, yoke fellow, we want you to be involved in this, and we want you to help them to come to agreement in the Lord, and those become the behavioral objectives in the letter. Now, we're about ready to stop. What comes across your mind? What have you learned? What stands out? Other than the cookies and the fruit and the other stuff was really good tonight. Anything coming together that you're beginning to kind of see as a pattern?
Well, that's just it. It all does come together. There's nothing chaotic about it.
Yeah. And remember, we talked about original intent. The better we can understand what the letter meant to the original readers on this side, then a letter should never say something to us that it would never have said to the people who read it in the first century. So then when we understand, this is the structure, here's the blue part of the letter, I want you to know, we're going to move to this part. Here's the things that are going to be here. Oh, finally, conclusion, travel plans. Here are the things here. And in all the letters except Colossians, in terms of to the churches, there is a behavioral objective. So I want to know that before I start reading the rest of the letter. Because if I know from the very beginning, like for example, if I'm teaching Philippians down the road, then one of the first things I'll do is look for the opening, the statement about God, something significant that's there. Let's do the closing. Are there things that match? Oh, and what does he ask them to do? And once I know the behavioral objective and what he asks them to do, then that becomes the lens through which, first of all, I read the letter from the first century and then try to make an accurate application to us 2,000 years later that matches and is consistent with the original intent as the letter was both written and understood by people in the first century. honor to have you guys here. What a blessing. So if you'll bring these back, we may do a little bit on the blue one next week, but you have the list that's here. And like I said, we'll have some that weren't here, so we'll do a quick review on some things. But we'll primarily go through and then identify all of the personal requests and look at how often Paul's signature is. He puts his arm around them and urges them, and we'll walk through that. And that way you'll have a working understanding of all the petitions in the New